I still remember the exact moment I realized how fragile certainty can be. Until that day, I believed that stability was something you built slowly, through agreements, consistency, and time. I believed that if everything was done correctly, if every document was signed and every obligation respected, the ground beneath you would remain solid. That belief disappeared quietly, without warning, when I was told that I no longer belonged where I stood. There was no chaos, no heated exchange, just a calm decision delivered with confidence, as if my presence had already been erased long before the words reached me. What unsettled me wasn't being asked to leave, it was how easily everyone else accepted it as inevitable. No one questioned the process. No one paused to reconsider. The assumption was simple. The situation was resolved, and I was on the losing side of it. In that moment, I felt something far more unsettling than fear. I felt invisible. It was as if years of responsibility, commitment, and understanding had been reduced to a misunderstanding that no one wanted to correct. I stood there listening, nodding, absorbing the weight of a conclusion I hadn't agreed with but was expected to accept. Yet beneath the surface of that calm exterior, my mind was racing. Something about the certainty in their voices felt premature, too convenient, too final. I knew there was a detail that hadn't been examined closely enough, something quietly resting in the background while everyone focused on surface-level assumptions. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I chose silence, because sometimes the most powerful response is not immediate resistance, but careful attention. What none of them realized was that the very foundation of their confidence was unstable. A single agreement overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed was about to reframe everything they thought they understood. At that moment, it seemed like I was losing ground. In reality, the reversal had already begun. What followed that moment was not immediate resolution, but a slow and deliberate process of understanding what had actually gone wrong. I didn't rush to defend myself, nor did I try to convince anyone on the spot. Instead, I took a step back and began retracing the path that had led me there. Situations like this rarely begin with a single action or decision. They are built over time, through assumptions that go unchallenged and details that seem too small to matter until they suddenly do. At the center of everything was an agreement made years earlier, during a period when trust outweighed caution and clarity felt sufficient without scrutiny. At the time, it seemed balanced, reasonable, and complete. No one involved expected it to become a point of dispute, least of all me. As circumstances evolved, however, interpretations began to replace the actual language of the document. Conversations grew more confident, yet less precise. People spoke as if memory and expectation carried the same weight as written terms. What struck me most was how quickly certainty formed around a version of events that hadn't been fully examined. There was an unspoken belief that what felt logical must also be correct. I began to realize that this situation wasn't driven by hostility but by momentum. Once a narrative takes hold, it tends to move forward without resistance. That realization changed how I approached everything that followed. Rather than reacting emotionally, I focused on understanding the structure beneath the claims being made. Agreements don't lose their meaning simply because time has passed or because people stop paying attention to them. They remain intact, waiting to be read with care. What appeared to be a closed matter was, in reality, still open, waiting for someone to notice what had been there all along. Before anything unraveled, my relationship with that property felt unremarkable in the best possible way. It wasn't dramatic, emotional, or unstable. It was simply part of my life, integrated into my routine so thoroughly that I rarely stopped to question it. I showed up when I needed to, handled responsibilities as they came, and operated under the assumption that consistency itself was proof of legitimacy. There was nothing urgent about my position, nothing that felt temporary. Stability, I believed, was created through repetition, and repetition had been my reality for a long time. That sense of normalcy is important, because it explains why the later shift felt so disorienting. Nothing about my day-to-day experience suggested that I was standing on uncertain ground. The agreement that governed my presence there had been signed years earlier, during a period when everything felt aligned. Expectations were discussed, terms were reviewed, and nothing raised concern at the time. It wasn't presented as a complex or fragile arrangement. In fact, it was framed as something reliable, something meant to prevent confusion rather than create it. Like most people, I trusted that a written understanding carried weight on its own. Once signed, it became background noise important, but not constantly revisited. I didn't feel the need to revisit it because there was no friction demanding attention. Life moved forward, and the agreement moved with it, quietly doing its job. Over time, circumstances around the property began to change, though not in ways that initially seemed threatening. Conversations shifted slightly. The tone became more formal. Questions were phrased differently. At first, I attributed this to natural evolution, people reassessing priorities, adjusting plans, or simply becoming more cautious. None of it felt directed at me personally. There was no open disagreement, no signal that my position was being questioned. In fact, interactions remained outwardly respectful. That's what made the later claims so difficult to reconcile. Looking back, I can see subtle signs of reinterpretation beginning to form, but at the time, they blended seamlessly into everyday communication. What I didn't realize then was how easily assumptions can replace documentation when people grow comfortable with their own interpretations. As discussions continued, references to the agreement became less precise. Instead of citing what had been written, people spoke in general terms, what they believed the arrangement was meant to achieve, how they remembered it, how they felt it should function now. None of this was hostile. It was almost casual. Yet casual certainty can be more dangerous than open disagreement, because it discourages verification. I noticed this shift, but I didn't challenge it immediately. Part of me assumed clarity would eventually return on its own. After all, the document still existed, unchanged. At that stage, my focus remained on cooperation. I continued fulfilling my responsibilities, believing that consistency would naturally reinforce my position. There's a quiet confidence that comes from doing what you're supposed to do, especially when no one openly disputes it. I believe that actions mattered as much as words, and that ongoing participation demonstrated legitimacy. That belief wasn't naive, it was based on years of experience where reliability had always been rewarded. What I hadn't accounted for was how quickly narratives can shift once momentum builds behind them. Once people agree on an interpretation, even an incomplete one, it begins to feel self-evident. The first moment I sensed something was wrong came not through confrontation, but through omission. I noticed decisions being discussed without my input, timelines forming without my awareness, conclusions being implied rather than explained. None of this was aggressive. In fact, it was delivered politely, almost professionally. That politeness made it harder to question. When interactions remain calm, it's easy to assume everything is still operating within agreed boundaries. I found myself reading between the lines, trying to understand whether I was overthinking subtle changes or whether something more significant was unfolding beneath the surface. It was during this period that I returned to the agreement for the first time in years, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. I wanted reassurance, not ammunition. As I read through it carefully, I was struck by how clear it actually was. The language hadn't changed. The structure hadn't shifted. The terms were still intact, detailed in a way that left little room for reinterpretation. What surprised me wasn't what the agreement said, but how different it was from the version being casually referenced in conversation. There was a growing gap between what was written and what was being assumed, and that gap seemed to be widening quietly, without anyone acknowledging it. At this point, I still believed that clarity alone would resolve everything. I assumed that once the document was reviewed openly, misunderstandings would dissolve. That assumption kept me calm. It allowed me to remain patient rather than defensive. I didn't feel the need to assert myself prematurely. Instead, I observed. I listened. I paid attention to how certainty was being expressed without verification. The more confident others became, the more careful I grew. Confidence doesn't always come from accuracy. Sometimes it comes from repetition. I could sense that repetition was doing its work. What stood out most was how rarely anyone referenced the agreement directly. It was treated as a technicality, something secondary to interpretation. The conversation had shifted from "what does the agreement say" to what makes sense now. That shift is subtle, but powerful. Once logic replaces documentation, outcomes become flexible. I realized then that the situation wasn't escalating because of conflict, but because of convenience. It was easier for everyone involved to move forward under a simplified understanding than to slow down and re-examine what had already been established. Despite these realizations, I still didn't anticipate being asked to leave. The idea felt disproportionate to the ambiguity I was noticing. I believed there would be discussions, clarifications, perhaps adjustments. Removal never crossed my mind. That's why the eventual demand felt so abrupt. It didn't align with the gradual nature of everything that preceded it. In hindsight, that abruptness makes sense. Once a conclusion is accepted internally, the delivery can appear sudden to the person left out of the process. The decision feels instantaneous, even if it took months to form. By the end of this chapter of the story, nothing had officially happened yet. No final statements had been made, no positions had been enforced. And yet the foundation had already shifted. The agreement was being mentally rewritten without ever being physically altered. That silent transformation was the real beginning of everything that followed. At the time, I didn't see it as a turning point. I saw it as a phase, temporary, manageable, resolvable. Only later did I understand that this was the moment where certainty quietly changed hands, long before anyone told me I no longer belonged there. The period that followed was defined less by action and more by atmosphere. Nothing concrete had happened yet, but the environment around me had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. Conversations felt more structured, more deliberate, as if conclusions were being rehearsed before they were ever announced. I noticed how often certainty appeared without explanation. Statements were delivered calmly, confidently, and without reference to where that confidence originated. It was subtle, but persistent. The more I listened, the clearer it became that an internal consensus had already formed, one that did not include me. What made this stage particularly disorienting was the absence of confrontation. No one accused me of wrongdoing. No one questioned my conduct. Instead, the tone suggested inevitability. Decisions were framed as procedural rather than debatable, as if the outcome was simply the natural progression of circumstances rather than the result of interpretation. I found myself responding to statements that hadn't actually been made yet, reading between lines that were becoming increasingly rigid. The calmness of it all gave the impression that resistance would be unnecessary, even inappropriate. That impression, I would later realize, was precisely what allowed assumptions to solidify. As time passed, references to the agreement became increasingly abstract. People spoke about intent rather than language, about understanding rather than structure. It was as though the document had become symbolic instead of functional. I began to hear phrases that suggested flexibility where none had been explicitly stated. Each time this happened, I made a mental note. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge the framing. I wanted to understand how this narrative was forming, because narratives rarely appear fully formed. They evolve through repetition, through selective emphasis, through silence. One of the most striking aspects of this phase was how quickly memory began to override documentation. People recalled discussions differently. Emphasis shifted. Details that had once been considered central were now described as secondary. None of this was presented as deception. It felt more like collective simplification. The complexity of the agreement was inconvenient, so it was gradually smoothed out until only a single interpretation remained. That interpretation was repeated often enough that it began to sound authoritative. Hearing something stated with confidence, even without evidence, has a way of reshaping perception. I began asking careful questions not to provoke, but to clarify. The responses I received were polite, yet vague. Answers referenced general principles rather than specifics. When I pressed for clarity, I was met with reassurances rather than explanations. It became clear that the answers weren't meant to resolve uncertainty. They were meant to close the conversation. That realization marked a shift in how I viewed the situation. This was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about momentum. Once momentum takes hold, it resists interruption. During this time, I returned repeatedly to the agreement itself. Each reading reinforced the same conclusion. The language was precise, deliberate, and still valid. There was nothing ambiguous about the sections being casually reinterpreted. What troubled me wasn't the content of the document, but how confidently it was being bypassed. I realized that documents don't assert themselves. They require someone to bring them into the conversation. Without that effort, they fade into the background, regardless of their authority. I also noticed a shift in how I was perceived. Interactions became more formal, more distant. Where there had once been familiarity, there was now procedure. I wasn't excluded outright, but I was no longer central to discussions that directly affected me. This change wasn't announced, it simply occurred. That kind of transition is easy to miss until it's complete. By the time you notice it, the new structure feels established, and questioning it feels disruptive. I could sense that my role was being quietly redefined without my participation. Despite this, I still believed that clarity would prevail. I assumed that when the agreement was eventually brought back into focus, the narrative would adjust accordingly. That belief kept me patient. It allowed me to observe without reacting prematurely. I wanted to understand not just what was happening, but how it was being justified internally by those involved. Understanding that process felt more important than winning an argument in the moment. What became increasingly clear was that the situation was being framed as settled long before it actually was. Language like moving forward and next steps appeared frequently, even though no formal conclusion had been reached. These phrases carry weight, they imply resolution. Hearing them repeatedly creates the impression that debate has already occurred, even if it hasn't. I began to realize that the most significant decisions are often made quietly, long before they're formally communicated. By the time they're announced, they feel inevitable. I remember one particular conversation where the outcome was implied rather than stated. The certainty in the delivery left little room for response. I listened, nodded, and asked no questions. Not because I agreed, but because I wanted to see how far this certainty would go without being challenged. That moment confirmed something important. The confidence I was hearing wasn't rooted in analysis. It was rooted in alignment. Everyone involved had aligned around the same interpretation, and alignment can feel indistinguishable from correctness. By the end of this phase, the gap between written reality and assumed reality had grown substantial. Yet no one acknowledged it openly. The agreement still existed, unchanged and accessible, but it had effectively been sidelined. The story being told no longer depended on what was written, but on what was repeated. I could sense that a formal declaration was approaching, even if I didn't yet know what form it would take. The environment had shifted from discussion to execution. Looking back, this was the moment when silence became my most deliberate choice. I wasn't withdrawing, I was preparing. I understood that when assumptions harden, challenging them requires precision, not emotion. The agreement wasn't going to reinsert itself into the conversation on its own. When the moment came, it would need to be introduced carefully, decisively, and at the right time. Until then, I watched as certainty continued to grow unquestioned, unverified, and increasingly confident, setting the stage for a moment that would finally force everything back into the open. The moment the decision was communicated didn't arrive with drama or raised voices. There was no tension in the room, no sense of conflict building toward a climax. Instead, it was delivered with the kind of calm confidence that suggests the matter has already been resolved elsewhere. I was informed, not consulted. The language used was measured and professional, carefully structured to sound reasonable and final at the same time. It wasn't presented as a possibility or a discussion point. It was framed as the natural outcome of a process that, according to them, had already run its course. What struck me immediately was how detached the message felt from any concrete reference. There was no mention of specific clauses, no acknowledgement of prior commitments, no invitation to review the foundation of the conclusion. The explanation relied heavily on phrases like "based on our understanding" and "light of recent considerations." These expressions carry an air of legitimacy, while remaining intentionally vague. They sound thorough without actually revealing anything. As I listened, I realized that the decision wasn't being justified, it was being normalized. I remember noticing how my own reaction contrasted sharply with what might have been expected. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge the reasoning in real time. I simply listened. Not because I agreed, but because I understood that this moment wasn't designed for dialogue. It was designed for acknowledgement. The structure of the conversation made that clear. The pauses weren't invitations to speak. They were checkpoints, moments where silence signaled acceptance. I chose not to fill them. There was a subtle emphasis on transition. Words like moving forward, next phase, and implementation were used repeatedly. These terms create psychological closure. They suggest that resistance would be an attempt to move backward, rather than a legitimate effort to clarify. It was an effective strategy, whether intentional or not. By framing the decision as progress, it placed any objection outside the boundaries of reasonableness. I could sense that the expectation was compliance, not conversation. As the implications of the decision became clearer, I noticed how responsibility was diffused. No single person claimed ownership of the conclusion. It was described as the result of collective review, of alignment among parties, of established understanding. This diffusion made the decision feel immovable. Challenging it would mean challenging everyone and no one at the same time. That kind of structure discourages direct opposition. It transforms a debatable outcome into an abstract consensus. I was informed that I would need to vacate the property within a specified timeframe. The delivery was neutral, almost administrative. There was no acknowledgement of the personal impact, no recognition of the history involved. The focus remained on procedure. By keeping the discussion technical, it avoided emotional engagement altogether. This approach can feel respectful on the surface, but it also creates distance. It reduces complex situations to logistical steps, making them easier to enforce and harder to question. What stayed with me most was the assumption that the matter was settled. There was an unspoken expectation that I would comply quietly, that I would adapt, that I would move on. The possibility of disagreement wasn't addressed because it wasn't anticipated. That absence spoke volumes. It suggested that my perspective had already been accounted for or dismissed before the conversation ever took place. In that moment, I understood how easily people mistake decisiveness for correctness. After the conversation ended, I didn't act immediately. I didn't make calls or send messages. I sat with the information, replaying the language used, the structure of the explanation, the gaps that had been left unfilled. The more I reflected, the clearer it became that the decision was built on interpretation rather than verification. It relied on assumptions that had never been tested against the actual agreement. The confidence behind it masked that weakness effectively, but it didn't eliminate it. I returned once again to the document at the center of everything. This time I read it not just for reassurance but for strategy. I examined how its language interacted with the claims that had been made. The contrast was striking. Where the decision relied on general reasoning, the agreement relied on specificity. Where the explanation was fluid, the language was fixed. That difference mattered. It meant that the foundation of the decision was far less stable than it appeared. What I also recognized was timing. Challenging the decision immediately would have shifted the focus to conflict rather than clarity. It would have reinforced the narrative that the issue was emotional rather than structural. I understood that if the agreement was going to be taken seriously, it needed to be introduced deliberately, not defensively. The goal wasn't to argue, but to re-anchor the discussion to something concrete. By the end of that day, the situation had changed in a very real way. The decision had been communicated. The expectation had been set. From the outside, it likely appeared resolved. But internally, I knew that the story wasn't finished. The certainty I had witnessed was built on a foundation that hadn't been fully examined. And foundations, no matter how confidently presented, cannot hold if they are misaligned with reality. This chapter wasn't about loss. It was about realization. It marked the point where I fully understood that the outcome being enforced wasn't inevitable, it was simply unchallenged. And that distinction would soon make all the difference. By the time I reached what I now think of as the fourth phase of this experience, the situation had stopped feeling external. It was no longer just about documents, conversations, or decisions being made by others. It had become internal. This was the point where I had to confront how uncertainty changes the way you see stability. When access to something you once considered secure is suddenly questioned, it forces a quiet but profound shift in perspective. I noticed myself replaying moments from the past, not out of regret, but out of curiosity. I wanted to understand how something that once felt so clear could now be interpreted as conditional. This stage wasn't dramatic on the surface. There were no heated exchanges or sudden developments. Instead, there was silence, waiting, and a growing awareness that outcomes are often shaped long before they become visible. During this period, I began to observe how systems respond to ambiguity. When rules are not actively examined, they tend to be replaced by habits. People fall back on what they've seen before, what usually happens, and what feels familiar. That familiarity can become more influential than accuracy. I realized that many of the assumptions surrounding my situation weren't based on malice or intent, but on repetition. Similar cases had unfolded in similar ways, so it was assumed that this one would follow the same pattern. The idea that this case might be different didn't initially register, because difference requires effort. It requires someone to pause and ask questions that slow everything down. At that point, I understood that progress would depend less on persuasion and more on interruption. What stood out most was how rarely anyone returned to the original wording of the agreement during discussions. References were made to summaries, interpretations, and recollections, but not to the text itself. The document had become almost symbolic rather than functional. This was when I decided to engage with it again, not defensively, but analytically. I read it line by line, not searching for leverage but for clarity. I paid attention to how responsibilities were defined, how conditions were framed, and how timelines were structured. It became clear that the agreement had been written with flexibility in mind, not rigidity. That flexibility, however, was now being treated as weakness rather than intent. The more I examined it, the more I understood that the problem wasn't the agreement, but the way it had been sidelined. Emotionally, this chapter was marked by restraint. I resisted the urge to accelerate the process or demand immediate acknowledgement. Experience had already taught me that urgency can undermine credibility. Instead, I focused on preparation. I organized my thoughts, documented timelines, and aligned my understanding with the exact language of the agreement. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about making the original structure visible again. I began to see that clarity doesn't always emerge through confrontation. Sometimes it surfaces when confusion is allowed to expose itself. By not filling every silence, I allowed space for inconsistencies to become apparent on their own. Another realization during this phase was how power often presents itself quietly. It doesn't always announce its presence. Sometimes it shows up as confidence, as routine, as the assumption that no challenge will come. That assumption had shaped the environment around me. Decisions were made with an air of finality, even though the foundation for those decisions had never been fully examined. I understood then that challenging an outcome doesn't require challenging authority directly. It requires questioning the process that led to that outcome. That distinction became central to how I approached everything that followed. I wasn't resisting the system. I was engaging it more thoroughly than it was accustomed to. As time passed, subtle shifts began to occur. Language in conversations became less absolute. Statements that were once presented as conclusions started to sound more like positions. This change didn't happen because of argument, but because of exposure. The more the agreement was referenced accurately, the harder it became to ignore its implications. I noticed that certainty began to give way to caution. People asked for time, for review, for confirmation. These were small changes, but they mattered. They indicated that the narrative was no longer moving unchecked. It had encountered resistance, not through force, but through precision. This chapter also forced me to confront my own expectations. I had assumed that fairness would be immediate once clarity was established. That assumption proved unrealistic. Systems move at their own pace, and recognition often lags behind understanding. Accepting that reality required patience. I had to separate progress from resolution. Just because everything wasn't resolved didn't mean nothing was changing. This mindset allowed me to remain steady. even when outcomes were delayed. I learned that endurance is often more influential than urgency, especially in situations where structure and interpretation collide. By the end of this phase, I no longer felt reactive. I felt grounded. The situation hadn't been resolved yet, but it had been reframed. What once felt like an irreversible decision now appeared provisional, dependent on factors that were still being examined. That shift changed everything. It marked the transition from uncertainty to possibility. Chapter 4 wasn't about a turning point in action, but a turning point in leverage. The foundation had been revisited, and once that happens, outcomes are no longer fixed. They are negotiated by the terms that were always there, waiting to be acknowledged. V unfolded with a different kind of tension, one that wasn't loud or immediate, but persistent and deeply psychological. By this point, the external situation had stabilized into a kind of waiting period, yet internally everything felt active. I became acutely aware of how moments like these test not just patience, but identity. When a situation challenges your sense of place, your right to remain, or your claim to something you believed was settled, it inevitably raises questions about self-trust. I found myself asking not whether the agreement was valid, but whether I had been naive to believe it would always be respected without question. That distinction mattered, because it reframed the experience from one of loss to one of learning. During this phase, communication became more formal and less frequent. Messages were carefully worded, responses delayed, and conversations carried an unmistakable tone of caution. This shift revealed something important to me. Uncertainty had spread. What once felt like a one-sided decision was now surrounded by hesitation. That hesitation didn't come from sympathy or concession, but from recognition. The agreement, once overlooked, had introduced complexity into what had been treated as a simple outcome. I realized that complexity is often the first real sign of balance returning to a situation. When things are oversimplified, power moves quickly. When details resurface, movement slows. I use this time to reflect on how easily clarity can be replaced by assumption when convenience is prioritized. No one had intentionally dismissed the agreement. It had simply become inconvenient. Acknowledging it meant reopening discussions, reconsidering timelines, and adjusting expectations. Avoidance in that sense was easier than engagement. Understanding this helped me let go of resentment. This wasn't about wrongdoing. It was about momentum overpowering diligence. That realization allowed me to stay focused on facts rather than emotions, which proved essential as the situation continued to evolve. Another critical element of this chapter was observation. I paid close attention not just to what was being said, but to what was no longer being stated with confidence. Earlier declarations had softened. Absolute language gave way to conditional phrasing. Words like final and decided were replaced with pending and under review. These weren't dramatic admissions, but they were meaningful. They signaled that the narrative was shifting from certainty to evaluation. In situations like this, evaluation is power neutralized. It opens space where outcomes can change. I also became more aware of my own role in maintaining stability during uncertainty. It's tempting to push for resolution when delays feel uncomfortable, but I had learned by now that pressure can be counterproductive. Instead, I focused on consistency. I responded calmly, referenced the agreement accurately, and avoided speculation. I didn't attempt to predict outcomes or assign motives. This approach wasn't strategic in the traditional sense, it was structural. By aligning my responses strictly with documented terms, I reinforced the relevance of the agreement without escalating the situation. This period also highlighted how time functions differently depending on perspective. For those accustomed to quick decisions, delays felt disruptive. For me, delays became an opportunity. They allowed space for careful review, for second thoughts, and for reconsideration. I understood that resolution wouldn't come from a single moment of realization, but from gradual acknowledgement. Each pause created room for the agreement to assert itself quietly, without confrontation. In that sense, time became an ally rather than an obstacle. Emotionally, Chapter 5 required discipline. There were moments when silence felt unsettling, when the lack of updates triggered doubt. I had to remind myself that progress doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it operates beneath the surface, through internal reviews and reconsiderations that aren't visible until much later. Trusting that process meant trusting the strength of the agreement itself. It had already survived neglect and misinterpretation. It didn't need urgency to prove its relevance. One of the most important realizations during this phase was understanding that outcomes are rarely reversed by argument alone. They are reversed when the foundation supporting them shifts. That shift was happening slowly, methodically, and without spectacle. The agreement was no longer an afterthought. It had become a reference point. That alone altered the balance of the situation. Decisions now had to account for it, rather than work around it. This change didn't guarantee a favorable outcome, but it restored fairness to the process. As Chapter 5 drew to a close, I noticed a subtle but meaningful change in how I felt. The uncertainty no longer felt threatening. It felt transitional. I had moved past the fear of being disregarded and into a space of quiet confidence. Not because I expected a specific result, but because I understood that the process had realigned with its original structure. The agreement was back where it belonged, at the center of the discussion. Whatever came next would have to pass through it, and that, more than anything else, marked progress. By the end of this chapter, I wasn't waiting anxiously anymore. I was prepared. Prepared for acknowledgement, prepared for resolution, and prepared even for further delay. The situation had taught me that stability doesn't come from control, but from alignment. When actions align with written terms, outcomes regain legitimacy. Chapter 5 wasn't about closure. It was about readiness. And sometimes, readiness is the clearest sign that the balance has already begun to shift. Marked the moment when everything that had been unfolding quietly began to surface with clarity. Not as a dramatic reversal, not as a sudden declaration, but as a controlled reorganization of understanding. By this stage, the situation no longer felt unstable. It felt deliberate. Conversations resumed with a different rhythm, one shaped less by assumption and more by verification. What had once been treated as settled was now openly acknowledged as unresolved. That shift alone changed the emotional landscape. I was no longer positioned as someone reacting to a decision, but as someone participating in a process that had been recalibrated. What stood out immediately was how differently the agreement was now treated. It wasn't referenced casually or indirectly. It was addressed directly, with attention to its structure, its language, and its intent. Sections that had previously been ignored were now discussed carefully, not defensively, but analytically. This was the first time since the situation began that the document felt fully present in the room, even when it wasn't physically there. Its relevance was no longer questioned. It had become the framework through which every remaining issue had to be examined. I noticed that the tone of communication had shifted again, this time toward balance. There was no longer an effort to push outcomes forward prematurely. Instead, there was a shared understanding that accuracy mattered more than speed. This wasn't presented as an admission of error, but as a commitment to completeness. That distinction mattered. It allowed the process to move forward without creating resistance. The focus was no longer on who had authority, but on what the agreement actually permitted, required, or restricted. Authority, in that context, became secondary to alignment. During this phase, I reflected deeply on how easily situations escalate when structure is overlooked. None of what had happened required escalation. It only required inattention. That realization reframed the entire experience for me. This wasn't a story about conflict. It was a story about correction. Systems are designed to function within boundaries, and when those boundaries are ignored, instability follows. Restoring them doesn't require force. It requires acknowledgement. That acknowledgement was finally happening. Another key development in this chapter was the emergence of accountability without confrontation. Questions were asked openly. Clarifications were requested without defensiveness. There was an implicit understanding that revisiting the agreement wasn't a challenge to anyone's position, but a necessary step toward resolution. I appreciated that shift, because it demonstrated maturity within the process itself. The agreement was no longer treated as an obstacle, but as a guide. That change transformed the dynamic entirely. I also became aware of how my own role had evolved. I was no longer focused on being understood. I was focused on being precise. I didn't explain my perspective repeatedly or emphasize the impact of the situation on me personally. I relied on the agreement to speak for itself. That restraint proved effective. When emotions recede, structure becomes louder. The clarity of the document created its own momentum. It didn't need reinforcement. It needed space. As discussions progressed, it became evident that earlier conclusions could not stand as they were. Not because they were unreasonable, but because they were incomplete. This acknowledgement wasn't framed as a reversal, but as a refinement. That framing allowed everyone involved to move forward without losing credibility. The outcome wasn't positioned as a correction of a mistake, but as the result of a more thorough review. In complex situations, that distinction often determines whether resolution is accepted or resisted. Time played a different role in this final chapter. It was no longer something to endure, but something to utilize. Each pause served a purpose. Each delay allowed for deeper verification. I understood now that resolution achieved too quickly often lacks durability. What was unfolding here felt stable because it was careful. The agreement wasn't being rushed into relevance. It was being integrated properly. That integration ensured that whatever outcome followed would be grounded, not provisional. Emotionally, this chapter brought a sense of closure that didn't depend on a single moment. Closure emerged gradually, through consistency and confirmation. I felt steady, not because everything had been finalized, but because the process had regained legitimacy. I trusted it again. That trust had been absent at the beginning, replaced by uncertainty and detachment. Now it had returned not as optimism but as confidence in structure. One of the most meaningful realizations during this phase was understanding that outcomes don't need to be dramatic to be decisive. The agreement didn't overturn everything with force. It realigned everything with logic. That realignment was more powerful than any confrontation could have been. It restored balance without creating opposition. It reminded everyone involved that written terms exist to prevent exactly this kind of drift. When they are respected, stability follows naturally. As Chapter 6 came to a close, the situation reached a point where further movement felt inevitable rather than uncertain. Not because a final decision had been announced, but because the framework for that decision was now undeniable. The agreement had reclaimed its place at the center of the discussion. Any outcome that followed would have to pass through it honestly. That alone ensured fairness. Looking back, this final chapter wasn't about winning or losing. It was about restoration. Restoration of process, of clarity, and of trust in documented structure. What began as an abrupt disruption ended as a measured correction. I didn't regain stability by resisting change, but by anchoring it to what had already been agreed upon. That lesson will remain with me long after this situation fades. As everything settled, I realized that this experience was never truly about the property itself, nor about the tension that briefly surrounded it. It was about how easily certainty can be built on assumption, and how quietly it can be undone by attention to detail. What initially felt like an abrupt ending revealed itself as a pause and opportunity to revisit what had been agreed upon long before emotions, urgency, or convenience entered the picture. The agreement did not change. What changed was the willingness to see it clearly again. That understanding reframed the entire journey, transforming uncertainty into perspective. Looking back, the most valuable lesson was not found in the outcome, but in the process. Stability doesn't come from authority or confidence alone. It comes from alignment between actions and written terms. When that alignment is lost, even well-intentioned decisions can drift. When it is restored, balance follows naturally. This experience reinforced the importance of patience, precision, and restraint. Not everything requires immediate reaction. Some situations resolve themselves when clarity is allowed to do the work. I also came to understand that resolution doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through careful review, measured conversations, and a return to structure. There was no dramatic reversal, no moment of triumph. Instead, there was confirmation. Confirmation that agreements matter, that details endure, and that processes regain legitimacy when they are respected. That kind of resolution is subtle but lasting. In the end, what stayed with me most was the realization that preparedness is power. Being grounded in what was documented allowed me to remain steady, even when circumstances felt unstable. This story isn't a warning or a victory, it's a reminder. When clarity replaces assumption, outcomes become fair again. And when fairness returns, so does trust.